So we all set?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hey, welcome everybody, both folks here and people watching the live stream at home. My name is Gil Barndollar. I'm a Portsmouth native and proprietor here at the Athenaeum. I want to thank a couple people. Tom Hardiman, our executive director, who's in the back here. Normally we do the introductions. But Essential Planning, who's helping to sponsor tonight's event, and then the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, who's also helped set this up and is running our AP. Our speaker tonight, Professor Brooke Harrington, is a professor of economic sociology at Dartmouth. She's an advisor to many organizations, including the OECD and the European Parliament. She's the author of several books, including the book we're going to speak about tonight, Offshore. So with that being said, turn it over to you, Brooke.
Thank you for having me here. This is my second visit to Portsmouth. I was here for 4th of July last year. Fell in love with the place. It's even better this time around. So it's a thrill to be back here and be able to share my research with you. Thank you to Fern and Suki for getting in touch with me months ago to try making this happen. So who here actually knows anything about offshore finance? Okay, that's useful to sort of get the sense of the room. I've been studying offshore finance for 17 years, and sometimes I forget what people know or don't know about it. Does anyone remember the Panama Papers? And the Paradise Papers and the Pandora Papers, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, by my watch, we're due for another one of those leaks pretty soon. So I'm here to tell you why they're important and why they affect our politics right now in America, but also like why they affect things we care about in the world, like democracy and capitalism. So I'm a sociologist, as Gil said. Has anyone here ever taken a sociology class? Good. Wow, that's probably the largest proportion I've ever seen in an audience. True confessions, I never took a sociology class when I was an undergraduate. I was an English major, so I can recite the prologue to the Canterbury Tales in Middle English, but I didn't see any point in sociology or taking classes in that domain. That was what the football players did. And I didn't really feel the need for any answers that sociology could provide until I'd went out in the working world for a while and realized that the world was not at all the way I had been led to believe it was. For one thing, it wasn't the meritocracy I had been led to believe. I know that sounds terribly naive, but you have to imagine me at 21, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, right out of Stanford, hippity-hopping right into the work world and going, wait a second, it isn't supposed to work that way. So it turns out that there is a whole subfield of sociology where you can study questions like, why isn't the world a meritocracy, and why do people get promoted if they hate management? So initially, yeah, like relatable, huh? So you can study those things and find useful answers in sociology. But while I was going to the PhD program at Harvard, I also learned that there was this completely, to me, undiscovered field called economic sociology, which basically consists of all the things you wanted to learn in economics class but didn't. All the crazy things people do with their money, for example. All the stuff you want to understand when you open up the newspaper or you listen to the evening news and you think, why are people buying Beanie Babies or NFTs? Like, that's crazy. Why are they doing that? Well, economic sociology has answers for those things too. But one of the things sociology is really supposed to do is help us explain inequality. I mean, some inequality is just inevitable in human life. People are different. When we talk about inequality in sociology, we're talking about the long-lasting intergenerational kind, like the American dream, where we created a society where it was possible for like my illiterate great-grandparents to come to this country, and then their grandson became a doctor and I got a PhD and became a professor. That kind of mobility creates a society where inequality is largely temporary. Not all societies have that. Why? If you have questions like that, sociology is one of the places you can go for answers. So in the wonderful world of offshore finance, I would say there's a lot we need to understand about, say, why the rich are getting richer at such a clip. You know, there were always rich people, but they're getting a lot richer a lot faster than they ever did in my lifetime, at least. Why is that? Because most countries in the world, most developed countries, have policies that are designed to prevent the wealth of any individual from getting totally out of control, so that, for example, they can sweep in and buy up a whole national government. That's not supposed to happen. There are all kinds of policies involving income tax, inheritance tax, corporation tax that are supposed to allow people to have incentives to innovate and to patent ideas and to be industrious, but not let them get so powerful that we get thrown back to like the robber baron era. And yet, many of those systems seem to have failed pretty dramatically. Why is that? That's the kind of question you go to sociology, although other social sciences do offer answers. Here's a fun fact about the world of offshore finance. When I say offshore finance, I'll define it for you more broadly in a second, but think about like Bermuda or the Cayman Islands or Singapore, or Hong Kong used to be one of the biggest offshore financial centers in the world. Today, the U.S. is one of the biggest offshore financial centers in the world, but only if you're not a U.S. citizen. A total of $12 trillion minimum in private household wealth is in that system. That's 12% of global GDP. GDP is all of the wealth that is produced in the entire world in the course of 1 year. It's a lot of money. And that does not include the wealth that corporations earn and put offshore. You ever wonder why Apple and Starbucks and so forth end up paying pretty close to zero in corporate income tax? It's because they incorporate in places like Ireland or the Netherlands to reduce their corporate taxation to zero. But there's this whole other world, the part I study, which is not corporations, it's individuals, wealthy individuals who use the offshore financial system. That use of the offshore financial system by private individuals costs governments of the world a minimum of $110 billion per year in taxes that should have been paid but weren't. And corporate taxes that should have been paid but weren't amount to at least 500. So that's a lot of hospitals and schools and roads, pension programs that should have been funded but weren't because the money wasn't there. I told you that I would tell you what the offshore system is. What is this place that allows individuals to hide their money? Not just from taxes, as I'll tell you in a minute. Well, if you ask an economist, they'll focus on the tax part. They're interested in what can be quantified, and what can most easily be quantified is the escape from taxation. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There is a group of people called economic geographers, and they study the offshore financial system too, but they look at it as a series of networks populated by elites, wealthy people. Anyone know how many billionaires there are in the world? Oh, like this?
Yes,
Sorry. It's okay.
Like into the top. Yeah. Turn it up. It doesn't turn up on that end.
There's nowhere to put, oh,
Switch.
I don't think, there's nowhere to put it. I don't
Oh, you
have
don't have a
pocket-
clip?
There's nothing I can put it on. I have to make do with this, sorry. Like a rap star. This feels very unnatural, but I'll try and remember to keep doing it. Are you sure that's not annoying? It has kind of a reverb on it. Okay. Thank you. In the world, how many? Guess? 3,000. But the billionaires who exist are getting wealthier at a clip that is unseen ever. Even it dwarfs the Gilded Age. So that's 1,000 people really have undue our government over governments of the world. If you wonder, when you pick up the newspaper, why there are so many anti-democracy movements flourishing in the world right now, it has a lot to do with those 3,000 billionaires. Why? Because it constrains them. You would think, if you're a normie like me, you think, if I had $1 billion, or a tenth of that, I would just sit quietly maybe at the Athenaeum and read a book. And you know, maybe pet some of the bunnies hopping around Portsmouth. Like, not a care in the world, and I wouldn't care what anyone thought of me. That is not, in fact, how billionaires think. They're competing with each other, like middle schoolers. They don't stop being adolescents just because they age and acquire a lot of money. So if you wonder why people like Bezos and Musk and Branson have their stupid little rockets going up into the stratosphere every so often, that is adolescent status competition scaled up to the level of people with billions of dollars. There's no and they read a lot of sci-fi, wrong lessons from it. People who know them well say. Anyways, that kind of status competition and the things that these billionaires want in the world is part of what I study. I didn't intend to study it. I just went looking for sort of the headwaters of the Nile, so to speak, the sources of growing inequality in the world. And I kind of backed into what I call the broligarchy, this group of men, primarily from the Silicon Valley, where I used to work, some of them from finance, but who have not just a lot of money, but a very distinctive political program that sets them apart from the rich people who have had an outsized voice in American politics since forever. You know, there's a reason that Wall Street bros haven't taken over the US government. They have a different philosophy and a different set of interests. The broligarchs are really different. The fact that they all sort of cluster together in the Silicon Valley and they talk to each other and egg each other on, they are steeped in an ideology that, as I'll show you, is actually very hostile to democracy and even hostile to capitalism, believe it or not. Although both of those things, American democracy and American capitalism, have made them the billionaires they are today. All of them started out as like the haute bourgeoisie, if you will. They're upper middle class, they had some money from their family. Jeff Bezos famously got like $300,000 from his family to start Amazon. But they weren't anything like they are now. And somewhere in that process of getting richer and richer and richer, they took a hard right turn that's very different from any of the billionaires we've ever seen before in American history. Political scientists study this to a certain extent. But what sociologists like me do is we look at the big picture. Like, what is offshore finance for? It's not a world of tax havens, primarily. It's a world that sells secrecy to rich people so that they can accomplish all those other things, like avoiding their taxes, avoiding regulations, engaging in activities to essentially overthrow or capture democracy to make it work for them and for nobody else. So once upon a time, right about 1906, there was a German sociologist by the name of Georg Simmel. And he wrote a very famous article that everyone who goes to graduate school in sociology has to read and then ignores for the rest of their career. And it's called Secret Societies. He made a point that hardly anyone has ever picked up on until I came along, in which he said, you know, inequality, the rich of the aristocracy and the rich of the criminal class both need secrecy to thrive. A lot of sociologists can quote that to you, but they don't really sort of explore the implications. As I began to study the offshore financial system, thinking I was studying tax havens, I realized what I'd stumbled upon was exactly what Simmel was talking about back in 1906. Why do they need secrecy? Because what they want is enormously unpopular, and they don't want the pitchforks and torches to come for them. One of the things you need to know about very, very wealthy people, I'm not talking about like the kind of people who might own a house here in Portsmouth. I'm talking about people who own disused missile silos in North Dakota that have been kitted out as end-of-the-world bunkers, who have bought farmland in New Zealand as their end-of-the-world hideaway, who are exploring Mars colonization, because they've all sort of collectively decided to give up on Earth and human life and say, oh, screw it, we're going to survive. Me and mine, we're going to get through this, and everyone else can take a flying leap. Very different also from the billionaires that have existed in previous points of American history. When I was a child, rich people may have thought that, but they couldn't vocalize it. It was not socially acceptable for a Rockefeller, for example, to say, you know what, I don't care about society. You can all get stuffed, you're all worthless. The rich people of the world are the ones who should reproduce. The rich people of the world deserve to survive. That is literally what people like Elon Musk say out loud, repeatedly. And Peter Thiel, who was a year ahead of me at Stanford and was holy terror back then too, he says that in print in places like the Wall Street Journal and in speeches. They don't care. That's a massive change just within my lifetime, and I'm not that old. Go back to like my parents' time during the Second World War. It's unimaginable that we would have the kind of elites that we have today. They simply would be shunned from polite society. Nobody would have anything to do with them. They'd be like Howard Hughes, you know, living with tissue paper containers around their feet in isolation. But now we have a guy who believes that his genes are special and makes him worthy to rule over everyone else on Earth. We have that guy in the White House directing cabinet meetings and meeting with foreign heads of state shoulder to shoulder with our elected president. That's a kind of a big problem. The thing is, because all this happens in secrecy, it's very, very hard to study. Billionaires, centimillionaires, they don't answer questions from nosy sociologists or from journalists. In fact, one of the first things people do when they get rich is they increase their privacy. They have minders and gatekeepers. Maybe they live in a gated community. Maybe they live on a yacht in the middle of the Mediterranean. They're not exposed to daily life. They become isolated from the concerns of real people, and they become detached from questions about why they're doing what they're doing. They talk to each other, and they egg each other on. In the case of the oligarchs, they've egged each other on into this profoundly antisocial, anti-democratic, anti-capitalist view of the world that whose destructive effects we're only just beginning to see. So my part of this story is I rolled up my sleeves and I got in there with them as best that I could. I couldn't arrange to inherit $1 billion. I couldn't get the National Science Foundation to lend me $1 billion so I could pretend. But when I was a kid, there was a television show that gave me some inspiration for this study. Does anyone remember Upstairs, Downstairs? My people. So that was on PBS when I was a little girl. I used to watch it with my parents. And the conceit of that show, in case you didn't see it, was that if you really want to understand the British upper class, talk to their servants. That was the downstairs part of Upstairs, Downstairs. So it dawned on me one day, having grown up in a wealthy suburb of Chicago and gone to public school with the kids of people who, if not billionaires, were probably centimillionaires. Believe it or not, back then they did send their children to public school because the public schools were really good. I knew from those kids that their parents didn't do much of anything on their own. They had people to change light bulbs. They had people to raise their children. They had people to cook their meals and clean their clothes. I knew that they didn't manage their own money for the most part. And one day I had a brainwave and I went, I wonder if I could study to be an offshore wealth manager. And I sat down at Google and I tip-tapped away, and lo and behold, you could. You just needed about 2 years and what was then about $50,000. Lucky for me, I was on sabbatical that year from Brown University at a think tank in Germany, and the guy who ran it had a $2 million €2 budget that he could sprinkle like fairy dust on anybody he thought had a worthy project, and he himself had just published a book about wealth. So he backed me to do this crazy thing. My intuition was, if I can go to wealth management school, I can talk to people who make the rich get richer, and maybe I'll find out something interesting about inequality. And that was the beginning of the study I'm going to tell you about. I found out who makes inequality happen and how. And I've been doing that since 2007. I still think one day, maybe 10, 20 years from now, we're going to look back on what we now know about the offshore financial system, the way people look back on ancient maps of the world. This is the Nuremberg Chronicle from 1493. That was the best guess about what the world looked like in 1493. There's no India, there's no China, of course, there's no North or South America, no Africa. It's very incomplete. And one day we'll look back on what we know in 2025 about offshore finance, and we'll kind of giggle at it the way we laugh at that map. But it's the best we have for now. And I'm doing my little bit to like draw in the missing bits. So let me introduce you to some of the people who use or have used the offshore system to become billionaires. And all these people are either heads of state or close to heads of state. Oh, except Robert Mercer. He's more the éminence grise, the man behind the curtain. Tell you. He was a hedge fund manager. He's in the U.S. Sebastián Piñera was the president of Chile. He used the offshore financial system to violate his own country's environmental laws. There was a population of endangered Humboldt penguins in Chile right near a very profitable mine, a mine that should have been shut down by the laws that Sebastián Piñera vowed to uphold. But he wanted a piece of that money, so he used offshore accounts to invest in that mining operation and enrich himself and his family. And all that came out in the Pandora Papers. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known. Oh, yeah, what did I do? Help. All I wanted was a pointer. Come back, slides. What did I do? I murdered my slides, sorry. There they are. Okay, I'm not going to attempt to use the pointer. So, see the sort of sad face guy up the upper right there? That's Andrej Babiš. He was the Prime Minister of Czechia. Middle guy is Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, and then on the right is King Hussein of Jordan. All those guys claimed to be reformers, especially opposed to financial corruption. All of them were exposed in one of the offshore leaks between 2016 and 2021 as being people who enriched themselves and used the secrecy of the offshore financial system either not to pay taxes or to take bribes or to do any kind of illegal activity that made them richer, just like Sebastián Piñera. And then at the lower right, we have Vladimir Putin and his BFFs, who were all intimately involved in the February 22 invasion of Ukraine. All of that money was laundered through offshore accounts. The Russians run the biggest offshore money laundry in the world. They need secrecy because what they want, almost everybody else on earth opposes. They're anti-democracy, anti-capitalism, but not just that, anti-public health, anti-science, anti the environment. These are the people who are like, yes, we should burn the world down because we're going to colonize Mars, or I'm going to go off to New Zealand and live on my farm. They don't care. Now, the odds of them actually surviving the meltdown of the climate are pretty slim, but they believe in all kinds of things. I mentioned to you before that Elon Musk is on record trying to seed the human race. He literally believes that. He's been having children, sex-selected for males, with dozens of women he barely knows, because he believes that he has this sort of special genetic gift that not only entitles him to rule us meaning 8.1 billion people on Earth, but also that he kind of owes it to us. Instead of philanthropy, instead of like being the Medici and giving the world, you know, the Duomo of Florence, he's giving us a whole bunch of more copies of his Y chromosome. Thanks, Elon. And this is the elite insurgency that I stumbled into. Musk is a very extreme example, but there are a lot of people who share beliefs that are adjacent to his. I'll give you some examples in just a second, but it's affected American elections. It's affected elections all over Europe. It affects what kinds of drug trials can be done on human beings, stuff that you probably thought was settled in the modern world. Like, there are certain things that you're just not allowed to do. Well, the people using the offshore system, the reason they're using it is because they want to do a lot of those forbidden things, not just not paying taxes. So Piñera is fine burning down his own country's environmental resources. This is the one that I find particularly chilling. Does anyone here know what the Tuskegee experiments were? So Peter Thiel is doing his own version of that on people with herpes, and because the FDA in the United States, as lightly regulated as this country is, they still won't let people do certain things, certain very unethical things that nobody should be allowed to do. And Peter Thiel wants to do them anyways. So he kind of bought up the government of the Caribbean island of St. Kitts and Nevis, and he's moved a bunch of people from the United States to St. Kitts and Nevis to do these totally unethical experiments on human beings with herpes. Kind of island of Dr. Moreau type stuff. This lady is Marine Le Pen. She is the figurehead atop the far-right party in France. This is Matteo Salvini, who was the leader of Italy's far-right party. Both of them were exposed in the various offshore leaks for being funded primarily through offshore accounts. Why? Because if you want to avoid a country's electoral laws, you just have to use offshore accounts to conceal what you're doing. Robert Mercer, the hedge fund manager I mentioned to you, he was one of the primary exponents of this. Robert Mercer was just an ordinary billionaire minding his own business until one day the IRS came to him and said, you've been sneaking around on your corporate taxes. You owe us $7 billion. Now, if you know that how underfunded the IRS has been over the last 20 years through Democratic and Republican administrations, / at the IRS, it is extraordinary that the IRS ever prosecutes wealthy people because they basically can't afford to. The wealthy people have better attorneys and more time on their hands. They can essentially play war of attrition with even a wealthy government like the US. But what Mercer did at Renaissance Capital, his hedge fund, was so egregious that even the IRS was like, okay, I guess we got to go after this guy. Mercer's response to that wasn't, oh, you got me to rights. It wasn't, let's talk about this. It's, I'm going to have your head, and I'm going to replace the entire US government to make sure this never happens again. Monomaniacal. So what he did was he created an offshore war chest. That's not my word, but the phrase of the journalists at The Guardian. Only $60 million, which to him is like probably the change he finds between the couch cushions. He put it in Bermuda, outside the reach of US law and British law, and he funded an organization called Cambridge Analytica. Does anyone know what Cambridge Analytica did? So they scraped your data without your knowledge from Facebook, and then they set about doing a whole bunch of unregulated and unethical human experiments, psychological experiments, to target people, profile people and target the ones they found to be so-called psychologically fragile, so to speak, prone to conspiracy thinking, easily frightened. Then they bombarded those people with fear messages. Oh my God, immigrants are coming, immigrants are coming. Like what you hear on Fox News about the caravans that always show up just in time for a midterm election and then disappear. In Britain, they did this with big billboards of like, Turkey wants to join the EU. Now that was never gonna happen, but if you wanna scare Europeans, put a billboard up with people who have like slightly tannish skin and who are Muslims. You can make them do anything in fear, basically. And a certain percentage of the British population, almost exactly 2%, were swayed to get Brexit voted for right over the line. So that was June of 2016. A few months later, Mercer and Cambridge Analytica used the same techniques on the US presidential election of 2016. And there's debate about how influential it was, but it did have some influence on people who were basically scared and manipulated into voting for Donald Trump, even though that's not normally what they might have done if they hadn't been bombarded by messages that were like targeted ads, but political ads in particular. So that's what he did. A lot of this came out in the Paradise Papers leak of November 2017. That was a couple terabytes of data that came from Bermuda and I believe Singapore. So that leak connected Brexit to the 2016 US presidential vote through Mercer's offshore funds. And then this is the really sad part. This sort of hurts me as an American to read out loud, but this was litigated for years. The US federal government attempted to hold Mercer accountable for violating federal election law, and they lost. The regulator was outmaneuvered at every turn by high-powered lawyers. That's how the game is played when you're sufficiently wealthy. If you wonder why the IRS seems to disproportionately target middle-class and poorer people for audits and punishment, this is why, because they can't win against the Mercers of the world. So I know about this, as I alluded to, because I spent 2 years training to be an offshore wealth manager. I thought I was just going to find the headwaters of the Nile of inequality. But what I backed into was this thing I'm calling the elite insurgency. The sense that a group of people who use the offshore financial system, they probably number in the tens of thousands worldwide. It's not a very big group. But they've turned against all the things that have made our lives possible right now. It made it possible for this to be live streamed on YouTube, made it possible for American life expectancy to go up into the 80s for both men and women, made it possible for me to be someone who got a PhD instead of like a house cleaner like my grandmother. All of those things that have made upward mobility possible, they don't want that anymore because it constrains their wealth and power just a little bit. Maybe it's only 5% or 1%. But they've radicalized. They're not that different from Al-Qaeda in the radicalization of their belief system and their antagonism towards many things that we hold dear, whether you're registered as a Republican or an independent or a Democrat. Most of us in this room are probably like, yay democracy, yay America. Let's do more of all the good stuff. Not these guys. They don't want any more of it. They became prosperous because of it, and now they want it to end for everyone but them. But they're not anarchists. This is important. They don't want to end the state and the rule of law. They want it to only work selectively for them. They want the law to enforce their property rights and their contract rights. But they don't want to have to protect the environment. They don't want to have to pay their fair share of society. They don't want to abide by what little employment law we have in this country. They don't want to support what little safety net we have in this country. You'd think it would be like a gnat. They would just swat it away. Like, okay, I'll pay my Medicare tax, whatever. But part of their belief system is that they are like Übermenschen, and they should not have to endure the indignity of being forced to acknowledge the rest of us as free and equal citizens. After I got this credential, I never practiced as a wealth manager. All it did was it opened the door so that I could attend wealth management meetings all over the world, because that's where they talk to each other about how they're accomplishing this insurgency, how they're enabling their clients not only to avoid paying taxes, but avoid paying their debts. Because wealthy people who don't want to pay their taxes, they don't want to pay anybody else either. They don't want to pay back each other when they borrow money from each other. They don't want to pay court judgments. They don't want to pay divorcing spouses. They don't want to leave money to kids they hate. Maybe they want to leave money to their pet Shih Tzu or something. Wealth managers help them do that. So I spent the next 15 years after I earned this credential going to wealth management meetings and interviewing individuals all over the world, not knowing if any of them would talk to me. There was pretty high suspicion at the beginning of this study that, of course, no one will talk to you. Their job is discretion and secrecy. If they know you're a sociologist, why would they ever talk to you? It's a horrible risk. For a variety of reasons I talk about in my new book and that I can talk about in the Q&A, they did talk to me. You have to imagine that I was sort of like Columbo. They did know who I was. I did not go undercover. I had a name badge on at all times. I had my real name, my real institutional affiliation. And by the ethics rules of sociology, I had to tell people I was doing research. But I think there's so few women in this world, and the ones that are there, I don't know, they didn't seem to fear me. And the men who were there, they wanted to explain things to me. Like, I asked them about their work, and they're like, sure, honey, pull up a chair. which wasn't entirely the experience I was expecting, but I was very grateful to it. One guy only stopped talking to me when the cafe we were in started turning off the lights and putting the chairs on top of the tables. Anyways, so through all that qualitative research all over the world, and I'll show you where I went in just a second, I generated some ideas like wealth managers are at the center of this offshore system. If you want to stop what happens offshore, you got to stop the wealth managers. So that's what we call in sociology a testable proposition. But when I was doing the research, until the very, very end in 2016 when the Panama Papers came out, there was no way to test it quantitatively. And then this massive data leak happened. Terabytes of data leaked from offshore just at the time my first book on offshore finance was coming out. It was a miracle. And then it happened again about a year and a half later with the Paradise Papers. And then, let's see, 4 years later with the Pandora Papers. So now there are almost 7 terabytes of data, which is an enormous Mount Everest of data, waiting to be plowed through to test the kind of ideas that I generated. And that's what I've been doing in recent years. So this is where I went, from places you would think of when you hear the words offshore finance, like the British Virgin Islands, to places you may never have heard of, like the Cook Islands, which are between Tahiti and Fiji in the South Pacific. And then South America, North America, Africa, Asia, Europe. And this is what wealth managers told me. Erica here in Switzerland said, our wealthiest clients are above the law, above nationality and laws. It's potentially very dangerous. She said that to me in 2012. Back when Elon Musk was just a charming, eccentric entrepreneur. Lewis, a wealth manager in London, said, what people fail to realize is that governments today are now just little parishes. Who do you think is more powerful, Procter & Gamble or the government of France? P&G, of course. They can set down their business anywhere in the world they please, and high net worth individuals are the same way. What he was saying, again, this was like 2013, is that his clients were more powerful than the government of developed countries. I was skeptical when I heard these things. I thought, this seems very extreme. But then people all over the world, wealth managers who didn't know each other and didn't know the data I'd been gathering from others, they kept saying the same things to me over and over again. And these were smart, well-trained people, not prone to hyperbole. And I was like, well, if they're scared, maybe I should be kind of worried. Maybe I should look into who these people are. This guy, he was the one who helped me close down that cafe after 3.5 hours. He said, he described his clients as a closed shop of wealthy people, which really made my ears perk up, because you know where the term closed shop comes from? Union organizing. It signifies a place that you can work only if you're a member of the union. It was like this ancient wealth manager was talking to me like he was Karl Marx. He was talking to me about class consciousness and class solidarity among this group of extremely wealthy people around the world. That was kind of unexpected. And he said the higher the economic ladder, the smaller the group becomes. And the people who went to business school together, they've to each other. So he was saying that there is coordination among the billionaires and centimillionaires of the world, and he, in fact, knew many of them. And he regaled me with the stories of how he was friends with Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, and Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, and you know, he rolled out his little Rolodex for me, and like apparently he really did know these people. He showed me pictures, and his comment was, all over the world, they know each other. They socialized with each other. They have a closed shop, and yeah, they do kind of have an agenda. The key insight of this, the good news, is that the number of professionals who help keep these people rich, numbers in the hundreds. It's very small. They can be slowed down or stopped, and that means slowing down or stopping a lot of the abuses that are happening in the offshore financial system. Things that are not necessarily illegal, but are certainly violations of the spirit of the law, if not the letter. Because that's what they teach you in wealth management school. They teach you, first of all, that there is a massive gap between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, and they teach you how to exploit and, if possible, widen that gap, and to walk right up to the edge of doing something that's illegal, but never cross over. And that's why we haven't seen many prosecutions, much less convictions, from the Panama Paradise and Pandora Papers. Because the company that was at the heart of the Panama Papers, Mossack Fonseca, law firm in Panama City, Panama, they only made one very terse statement after the Panama Papers broke in 2016. And they said, essentially, if you don't like what we do, change the laws, because we didn't break any. And for the most part, they're right. Or at least what they did is so legally debatable that no government has the money and time to really nail it down. So effectively, they get away with it. And that's what they teach you. That's what they taught me how to do in wealth management school. Well, now that we're all energized by that, let me just walk you through really briefly what I mean when I say I was taught how to evade the spirit of the law while abiding by the letter of the law. You know how magicians make the rabbit disappear into the hat and then they pull it out somewhere else? That's what a wealth manager can do with your money. In fact, of one UK wealth management firm is, in fact, I want to be invisible. They are literally selling secrecy to clients. What they're making invisible are the assets that would otherwise be subject to taxation or debt collection or divorce settlements or what have you. Because if you can make assets invisible legally, you can't tax them. You can't regulate them. So what you do is you...
I'm going to put this here for you, because as you turn away from the speaker on the back, that's...
Okay.
Hopefully okay.
What you do as a client wealth manager, did that help? I've always wanted to do karaoke.
We'll get the song back from the phone.
Yeah. Stand by your man. So what you do is you make it unclear who owns what. If you followed what happened after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, you know that governments all over the world, especially in Europe, seized a bunch of mega yachts from Russian oligarchs. And then they got stuck maintaining them at the cost of a couple €100,000 per month. The problem was those yachts couldn't just be sold and the money given to Ukraine, which is what a lot of people wanted to see happen. Because it's one thing to seize an asset, it's quite another to prove in a court of law that asset belongs to this oligarch. We've sanctioned that oligarch, therefore we now have the legal right to sell the asset and give the money where we please. That's the difference between seizure and, I forget what the other legal term is for it, forfeiture. Seizure and forfeiture, there's a huge gap between those things. And it's taken years in many cases to prove who owns those assets of Russian oligarchs, because those yachts are not like titled under the name of like Vladimir Putin or Alexei Mordashov. They're titled in the names of offshore entities which are wrapped in other offshore entities which are wrapped in other offshore entities. And it often takes years to dig through those layers to say, oh, okay, at the end of the day, it really does belong to Mr. X. Most countries can't afford to go through that years-long process of showing who really owns an asset. This is actually a clip from one of my wealth management textbooks. This image was shown as this is a baby version, an ABC version of how to create offshore structures for clients. And as you see, one of the assets down there on the lower right is in fact a yacht. But you don't just have the yacht out there, you wrap it like bubble wrap in a company. And then you put the company inside of a trust. And you put the trust inside of a private trust company. And then you put the private trust company in a foundation or a purpose trust. And each of those layers is located in a different jurisdiction and a different legal system, hopefully in a different language. So that if you're, say, the government of the EU, or the US, and you want to prove that that yacht belongs to sanctioned oligarch Alexei Mordashov, what you do is you start at layer number 1 there. What's publicly visible is the foundation, and you have to drill down through each of those 4 layers, and there's probably actually a lot more than 4 layers in the real world, to prove that you can connect Mordashov to the yacht. It's quite complex and time-consuming because it often involves the legal systems of many different countries. So you have to hire specialists in the laws, people who are admitted to the bar in each of those different countries. That's a lot of international coordination, and of course it's very expensive. So you divide up a client's assets and you scatter them like confetti, and you scatter the structures that hold them like confetti all over the world. Preferably you go to specialized offshore financial centers that have what are called firewall laws, which are designed to, like those rumble strips in rental car companies that have sort of teeth, that if you back over them, it'll blow your tires. Firewall laws are legal systems that are designed to repel inquiries from foreign countries, to make it so it's impossible for those foreign countries to get the information they want or to win legal cases. So places like the Cook Islands that I mentioned to you on my little map, they have firewall laws. In social science, there's this concept called transaction costs, the cost of doing business. What the name of the game here for a wealth manager is to make it so costly for governments or divorcing spouses or disgruntled business partners to track down the trail of title and legal ownership on any given asset that they might want to claim, that it becomes prohibitively expensive and they simply give up. And I'll give you some examples where great big companies you've heard of have done exactly that in the face of the strategies I just showed you. And essentially what you're doing at a high level as a wealth manager is you're playing with the sovereignty of nation states. You're saying, oh, St. Kitts and Nevis will allow me to do X, and then Singapore over there will allow me to do Y, and I want a little bit of both. So I'm going to have a trust in St. Kitts and Nevis, and I'm going to wrap that in a foundation from Singapore. And then I'm going to wrap all of that in an Irish corporation. That's essentially the game that Apple and Starbucks and so forth play in order to make themselves tax-proof. But you can do it as an individual too. This in itself really messes with how democracy is supposed to work. You're not supposed to be able to shop among countries for the laws that you like the way you would go to the shopping mall and take your pick among the offerings of different shops. But that's exactly how it works if you're sufficiently wealthy. You pick and choose the laws you want to abide by, you pick and choose the laws you want to protect your stuff, and then you ignore the rest. Even worse, many of the wealth managers I spoke to spontaneously volunteered to me that they had been asked by offshore financial centers to write the laws of those countries so as to suit their wealthy clients. So a typical scenario would be the government of Mauritius, which is a small island in the Indian Ocean between Africa and India. They've been an important offshore financial center for decades. They might come to you and say, we understand that you serve a lot of Indian billionaires and we want more of their money in our country. So why don't you tell us what their wish list is and we'll make that into law. Or if you're a lawyer, they'll say, why don't you draft the legislation that your clients want and we'll pass it, we'll rubber stamp it. And case after case after case after case of this happening. It's people who were firsthand involved in those situations telling me about it, third-party reporting, documenting it. It's wild. And like, imagine what this does to the people who live in those burgeoning post-colonial democracies like Mauritius. Their democracies are being hacked by foreign wealth. People who will never set foot in their country, in all likelihood, are basically pulling the strings on their legislature so that their votes are essentially, the votes of people who actually live in those countries are ceremonial at best. That has all kinds of knock-on effects. Like, if you live in a country like that, are you going to be happy about paying taxes? Are you going to be happy about bringing up your kids there? No. If you have any kind of skills at all, you're probably just going to leave. And then who gets left behind? the people who are least able to build up your country and make it prosperous. So it becomes more dependent on foreign wealth. It's very much a vicious circle. In fact, there's a name for it. It's called the finance curse, and it's the subject of chapter 4 of my book. Many tragic stories all over the world of fragile post-colonial democracies in the 70s taking this Faustian bargain of saying, okay, we'll become offshore financial centers. Our fishing industry isn't doing so well. We only get so many tourists every year. They're like Delaware or South Dakota or Wyoming, the American states that have become some of the most popular offshore financial centers for non-American citizens are precisely the ones you would predict because they have fragile to non-existent economic bases. They can't keep the lights on in government, so they take this bad bargain and say, well, we'll take some money from foreigners and help them hide assets from their home governments, just for a little fee here and there. And it ends up eroding and eating away at democracy and the economies of all of those places. So now for the good news. It's about time, right? Remember I mentioned to you that the number of people who actually understand how these systems work probably numbers in the hundreds or the low thousands. That's really good news because it means it's possible to slow down or stop many of them. And this is what these offshore leaks have meant. For the first time, I can actually test these ideas. Are wealth managers really central to the offshore financial system? Now I can show it. I had to find some partners at Dartmouth, network scientists and computer scientists who had the quantitative skills I lacked. But we did it. We showed it. We had a 2023 article where we actually showed the networks of offshore finance, especially the ones held by Russian oligarchs who were sanctioned. And we showed exactly how central their wealth managers were and how if you somehow were to stop the wealth managers, sanction them for a change, the oligarchs' access to their offshore wealth would be completely cut off. And this actually happened in 2022. If you read the Financial Times, you may remember there were these hilarious articles around March, April of 2022 in which oligarchs like Peter Avin and Peter Friedman, who are very close associates of Putin, who live in London, were wiping the tears away, telling journalists from the Financial Times how hard up they were because they could no longer afford to pay for their chauffeurs and cooks. What are we supposed to do? They said, drive ourselves around London? Take the tube? Make grilled cheese? And yeah, the answer was yeah. They were actually getting a very generous allowance from the British government, but they didn't have access to their offshore funds anymore. And that meant they were dead in the water as political actors. And that's what we want if we want to protect democracy. So the main findings of the work I do now are to take all the ideas I generated from the qualitative research I did and to test them quantitatively using this giant pile of offshore leak data with the help of my colleagues in computer science and network science. What we're finding is very surprising. It turns out that the offshore networks of oligarchs look a lot like airline networks. You know how when weather hits Chicago, the whole Midwest airline network goes down? That's how an offshore network is arranged too, except that the hubs, instead of being an airport like O'Hare, the hubs are the wealth managers. If somehow you're able to take them out of the picture, the whole system becomes what's called super fragile in network science. You can just shatter it like a piece of glass. This, by the way, suggests why many of the people who were sanctioned in the 2022 invasion of Ukraine were repeat offenders. They'd been sanctioned by the US government many times before, and by the UK government, and by the European Union. And yet it hadn't stopped them from funding the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Why not? I contend it's because the sanctions were targeting the wrong people. They were targeting the beneficiaries of the offshore system, but not the people who actually made the system work, the wealth managers. But you can sanction wealth managers. Let me show you. So these are some of the people that we found in the Panama Paradise and Pandora papers. That's kind of the rogues gallery of some of the sanctioned oligarchs from February 22. And this, that circle with circles inside it, that's what the offshore network of all those people looks like. the little yellow dots in the center, those are the hubs. Those are wealth managers. And then all the stuff around them is the oligarchs and their corporations and their trusts and foundations, all those structures I told you about. Then on the inset down at the right, it turns out that all these sanctioned oligarchs, they're not strangers to each other. In fact, they can be connected through their wealth managers. You know how Hollywood celebrities, they don't go looking in the yellow pages when they need someone to babysit their kids or cut their hair? They ask other people like themselves because they need people who are not just competent at their jobs, they need people who are trustworthy and discreet, who can be counted upon not to sell photos to the tabloids of them, you know, in indiscreet positions. It's the same thing if you're an oligarch and you have a wealth manager. The wealth manager knows where the bodies are buried. Anyone here ever see the Godfather films? In the Godfather films, there is an Irish-German attorney by the name of Tom Hagen who literally knows where the bodies are buried. Anyone here who hasn't seen the film, spoiler alert, shut your ears and say la la la. He's the guy who puts the horse's head in the Hollywood producer's bed. He does the dirty work. This is what a wealth manager does. And several of the wealth managers I interviewed actually volunteered that they were like the consiglieri of mafia families. That is a map that I would wager looks very much like what the consiglieri of mafia families do to connect mafiosi. Because if you're a mafiosi, if you're doing stuff that's questionably legal or flat out illegal, the more people who know your business, the more vulnerable you are. So you have to concentrate all of the dirty work in a very small group of experts. And that's what we see here. That's a vulnerability that we can exploit from a policy perspective. So socially, we see from these diagrams, these are network diagrams, that wealth managers not only link oligarchs to offshore entities, but to other oligarchs. Like there's this organization on the left here called Marcom Management. It connects the entire Rotenberg family. Those are the a family, two brothers and a son, who are the judo partners of Vladimir Putin. They all use the same wealth manager. And that wealth manager also connects them structurally to other wealth managers and other oligarchs. And the wealth managers tend to use the same organizations in the same places. So there's this place called the third floor of the Yamraj building in the British Virgin Islands that links 4 separate oligarchs. So they're all using similar laws in similar countries to achieve similar purposes. If we could see the offshore networks of, say, drug dealers and arms dealers and human traffickers, they'd probably look very much like that. Remember Georg Zimmel's insight that secrecy allows both aristocrats and criminals to accumulate the wealth and power they have? It is literally true in the offshore financial system. And criminals use it just alongside of people who are merely billionaires on the right side of the law. I won't get into the details of this, but basically what the blue and the green lines show is if you look at oligarchs who come from authoritarian countries like China and Russia, where their main concern using the offshore financial system is not to avoid taxes. Russia's nominal tax rate on income is something like 10%. There's almost nothing to avoid. What they're avoiding is political retribution. Same thing with Chinese billionaires. One day, the president of your country might get up on the wrong side of the bed and decide you're an enemy of the state, seize all your assets, and throw you in prison. What are you going to do? Your insurance policy is you get as much of your wealth as possible offshore, you get your family offshore, you get them passports for Canada or Britain or the United States, and then you're safe. You get yourself one of those passports, and then you stay a step ahead of the secret police and you run to the embassy with your passport in your hand and you say, I'm claiming refuge here. The secret police are out to get me, and then they airlift you back to Canada or the US or the UK. That's how the game works. And that's why all these people have 3, 4, 5 passports in addition to many, many offshore accounts. So all of this together points to a strategy to fight kleptocracy, and that strategy is simply sanction the wealth managers. That doesn't mean putting wealth managers out of business. Sanctioning a wealth manager means saying, you can't work with sanctioned clients. So practice your profession, but You can't work with Ponomarenko. You can't work with Mordashov. You can't work with the Rotenbergs. Go work with somebody else. That's actually a strategy that was implemented to great success after the invasion of Ukraine. And it has a decades-long history. The first ideas about sanctioning the use of expertise came out of the Cold War. Because, you know, around the 50s, nobody wanted nuclear experts going to give lectures at the University of Stalingrad about their latest discoveries. Same with chemical weapons, biological weapons experts. So all those people could still practice their profession, do their science or what have you, but they couldn't share what they knew with certain parties, whether it was countries or individuals. What I'm proposing is do the same thing with wealth managers. And that is, in fact, what the US, the UK, and the European Union did in 2022, really for the first time, and it worked great, like gangbusters. And I think they should do more. So the whole point of this is understand more about inequality and its sources. How is it done? Unexpected discovery was that there's this group of professionals numbering in the low thousands worldwide who have an enormous amount of power. We don't know much about them. And unlike doctors and lawyers and accountants, they're not licensed by the state. So this is the funny thing about wealth managers. If you want to sanction them or restrict them in any way, you can't threaten to pull their license because they're not licensed. Anyone in this room could hang up a shingle on their door and say, I'm a wealth manager. Nobody could stop you. Now, that doesn't mean a billionaire is going to come looking for you to manage their money. But what it does mean is it's trickier to sanction someone who isn't licensed or under control of the state in the first place. There are ways to do it, though. So I've written about that. And last August, I got a grant from the National Science Foundation to do more of this network research on a global scale to find out more about the networks of oligarchs from other countries, like, say, Brazil or India. And knock on wood, Doge won't discover me and cancel my grant. I want you all to like pray nice little secular prayers that I get to hold on to that grant until it's over in 2 more years. Because I think it's really important work, and we're discovering very interesting things. In fact, with my colleagues in network science, we're trying to pull in data from publicly available information about the pathways that private jets and private yachts take all over the world, because we think we can find out more about these offshore networks by looking at the socialization patterns of people who own mega yachts and private jets. And I'm editing a special issue of a journal on this subject. But this is probably more relevant to you guys. My 2 books on offshore finance. I'm happy to answer your questions, sign books, what have you. And thank you again for letting me talk about my work.
Tim. All right, that's way too loud. Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to 2 quick questions because I think we have reception downstairs, we have books downstairs. So I'll ask 2 quick questions and then take a few from you folks. Brooke, and thanks for a great talk, and the book's fantastic. I'm struck by a couple interesting pieces in your bio, and you mentioned them both briefly. Lake Harrington, being from Lake Forest, and then being at Stanford at the same time, you're a contemporary of some of the folks that are the prime offenders, or the most, visible domestic examples of this, right? This is sort of a sociological question that's adjacent to your work, but that cohort of people, I mean, all of those guys, maybe with the exception of Thiel, but that group of Stanford or Stanford-influenced tech billionaires a decade ago, the Saxes and Keith Rauboys and Musk, who's not a Stanford guy, we're all just kind of like, at least in as much as anybody knew, kind of banal middle-of-the-road Democrats. What is the kind of cohort radicalization for people like that, as best as you can tell?
As best I can tell, it's part self-selection into the industry and into the Silicon Valley community, and it's part radicalization of each other. So people like me who are English majors and who love like history and books and stuff, we don't jump willingly into work in like software and hardware design. In part because the people who do that for a living generally don't want to talk about the stuff that we find enjoyable. Like I actually spent 2 years working at software startups in the Silicon Valley, and it was very instructive. I learned a great deal, but it was also kind of lonely because nobody I worked with could talk about anything that I cared about. In fact, my boss bragged about never reading books, and this was like 35 years ago, and I cannot tell you how horrified I was by this man. I was like you couldn't waterboard information like that out of me, but he was proud of it. And there were a lot of people, like especially men who seemed to interface well with machines but not with other humans. I shared an office with a man who he was not a promising physical specimen, but he had nonetheless spent what little money he had saved to sign himself up for what was then the big fad in human life extension. Like all these guys are obsessed with living forever. Like they have read a lot of sci-fi, but they've completely taken the wrong lessons from it. So this guy thought that his consciousness was so valuable to humanity that he'd saved up to have his head cut off and cryogenically frozen. That's redundant, isn't it? Cryogenically preserved until some future technology could unfreeze him and like make him a talking head, like from Futurama. And he wore one of those little metal alert bracelets to say to paramedics, don't inject certain chemicals into my body. So this guy would say things to me like, I had to have lunch with him one day, and my boyfriend was sitting next to me, and this guy just looked at me like with a bite of sandwich in his mouth saying, "You'd make a really good porn star." Now, imagine someone who would think that was an okay thing to say to a coworker with whom he shared an office with her boyfriend sitting right next to her. Like that is someone who is not socially with it. And he was not an outlier. Another guy I worked with, also not a very promising physical specimen, kind of leaned in one day and said conspiratorially, the reason I'm going to be CEO of this company is so I can round up the fertile females. So 30 years later, when I hear Elon Musk talking about seeding the earth with his offspring, in a way this is like chillingly familiar. Like I know that guy or that type of guy, but I used to think they were like fringe weirdos. The problem is our fragile regulatory system, our freedoms have basically allowed people like this to attain so much wealth and power that they become essentially ungovernable, and they're proud of it. And now all their weirdo crackpot ideas that are fundamentally hostile not just to democracy and capitalism, but to humanity, they have all this power. They shouldn't be within a country mile of the White House. Like, let them go live on their little islands in the middle of the Pacific and have their weird little beliefs. It's a big tent. But they don't get to tell the rest of us on Earth how to live. But that is exactly what they're doing, and that's why they're so terribly dangerous. And the problem is now, you've probably seen reporting that says there are all these like Slack conversations and signal chats where these guys are egging each other on, again, like middle schoolers saying, do it, bro, do it. And what they're egging each other on to do is basically overthrow democracy in America and around the world. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that.
Yeah. Again, love the book. It's short, but there's a ton packed in. The only thing really I wasn't persuaded by, at the end, your sort of prescription after a lot of description, right? You say towards the end that social stigma is kryptonite for offshore elites, and that legal change, regulatory change takes a long time.
and you alluded to that in the beginning of the talk, I'm a little skeptical of that in the sense that, as you said, some of these people are on another planet and don't really care about this, any kind of stigma. I'm talking more domestic elites maybe than international, and what happened to Russian oligarchs strikes me as a different animal than our own tech, aristocracy here. But I'm skeptical that social stigma, especially when there's almost an inverse kind of value system that these people propagate and and have plentiful channels to kind of beat the drum for, that's going to be more effective than the legal hammer.
I totally get where you're coming from on this, and it is true that many of these people are shameless in a traditional sense, in the sense of those of us who remember a world in which there were widely shared social norms knew that there were certain boundaries you could not cross. You might believe that, say, taxes are theft, but you wouldn't say that out loud. You wouldn't get up on a presidential debate stage and brag about not paying taxes for 19 years. You may have done it and be secretly proud of it, but you never, never, never say it. The capacity to shame people based on a widely shared normative system is largely gone. We're too fragmented for that. But that is different from saying that these people are immune to stigmatization. In fact, for those of you who are deep in the weeds of social media, you know that Elon Musk bought Twitter largely because people were making fun of him on it. Peter Thiel drove an online magazine called Gawker into bankruptcy because they outed him as gay, and he didn't like that. So they are still, they're subject to concern about their image management. They cultivate an image as these supermen, and they don't like it when we puncture that bubble by mocking them or exposing them in ways they don't want to be exposed. So, you know, an ill-behaved 11-year-old might be shameless, but they're very sensitive to their social image, whatever it is that they're cultivating. And that's how these guys work. It's a very immature way of functioning in the world, but you can see they've made huge investments in protecting silly little images that many of us laugh at, but they take with deadly seriousness.
The Musk video game skill.
Exactly.
I mean, that's it, yeah.
I mean, how pathetic is it that you have to pay someone to be good at a video game for you?
Right.
But Musk loses his mind when you point that out. So what I'm saying is exploit that Achilles heel, because it's nonviolent, it's available to civil society, you don't have to get the permission of your government to do it, you don't have to engage international coordination. Lawmaking takes years, and that system has been hacked. But one of the reasons that social media is dangerous, especially in more autocratic countries, and the reason why, say, when Iran had its green revolution, first thing they did was shut down the internet so people couldn't communicate with each other. Not just so that they couldn't get on the streets together, but so that they couldn't mock their leaders, because that makes people less afraid. And when they're not afraid, they'll stand up and defend their countries. They don't want us to do that.
Thanks. Got time for a few questions. I'll repeat them again on the mic, so try to keep them kind of concise, and that's for the benefit of folks watching the video. Yep, back, sir.
Yeah, and two quick questions. One is, of the 3,000 billionaires, how many are like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett in the giving pledge vote versus the ones you mentioned? Okay. And my other question is, the wealth managers you mentioned, are they employed, are they self-employed, or are they employed by global wealth advisory firms?
I'll take the second question
Want me to
first.
repeat them real quick?
Okay.
Two quick questions. One about the giving pledge and how many billionaires kind of fall into that, maybe more virtuous set. And the second question, wealth managers, who pays them? Are they self-employed, or are they paid by firms, or what's that structure look like?
The employment structure, the labor market for wealth managers is divided. There are different models. Like if you work for a sufficiently wealthy person, you might just work for that person. People who have, say, $50 billion or more in investable assets, meaning their net worth minus the value of their primary residence, those people have family offices. So they have one or two or three or a whole stable of experts who work only for them and their families. There are people who manage the taxes. There are people who manage the philanthropy. It's like a wealth management firm dedicated only to you. The less wealthy you get, the more you have to share your wealth manager. So if you have 20 million or more in investable assets, but not quite 50 million, you'll probably work with a boutique firm. Maybe it's a sole proprietorship, a guy who has like 2 colleagues, and they have 10 clients under management, but they're so big all they can do is like manage those 10 clients. And then the less wealthy you get, the more you have to share your wealth manager, the more likely you're going to be working, not with a boutique firm, but with like an HSBC or a UBS. And then, you know, walk into the Mascoma Bank or the Bank of America, and that they might have a little plaque up that says wealth management for you. That's not at all what I'm talking about here. They're not going to put your money offshore. So remember when I said wealth management isn't regulated like the law or like medicine or accountancy? Anybody can call themselves a wealth manager, and a lot of financial institutions take advantage of that to sell you something they can't really offer but kind of sounds good. To answer your other question of like, how does the orientation of the world's 3,000 billionaires break down in terms of like, do they belong to that old school world that people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates Sr. seem to represent? And this is where you get into things like the concept of old money versus nouveau riche. The old money people come from that, say, pre-Reaganite world where society really did expect wealthy people to at least simulate some concern for the rest of society. Regardless of whatever their internal beliefs were, you had to at least pretend to be civic-minded. And that's why you get, you know, Andrew Carnegie endowing hundreds of libraries all over America, and Rockefeller endowing libraries and universities, and all manner of philanthropic activities. That's where you get John F. Kennedy, right before he became president, talking about, I think he was paraphrasing the book of Luke in the Bible, where he said, to whom much has been given, from those much is expected. That's the old money mentality. And society used to enforce that through stigmatization. If you didn't at least simulate respect for that behavior, you weren't going to be invited to Mrs. Astor's party on Fifth Avenue. You weren't going to be able to marry your sons and daughters into the country club set. No decent people would have you around. But starting with the sort of greed is good era in the 80s, that ethos crumbled, and it's now come to be regarded as for chumps. You know, caring about society, caring about fellow humans is for chumps. And there are some holdovers. Bill Gates of Microsoft is the son of an old money guy. And so he's old enough to have kind of gotten that ethos from his father and be part of that world, although he dabbles with the others, the Musks and Jeffrey Epstein and so forth. But Musk and Bezos, Thiel, they came from like upper middle class or middle class backgrounds at best. They're all nouveau riche, and they don't give a fig for any of that old money ethos. And they're so wealthy now that if anyone were to try to disinvite them to parties, they don't care. I don't know if anyone saw what Jeff Bezos' fiance wore to state dinner and to the inauguration. Coming from this old world, old money waspy world, I had like full body cringe at this woman wearing lingerie, basically, to the inauguration of her president. I'm horrified. And she did the same thing when the Biden administration invited her to represent the US in front of a delegation from Japan. I was just dying inside because she looks really, really trashy. And like, it was the most nouveau riche thing you could ever imagine. It's the sort of thing you would strut around Vegas in if you were a showgirl, but you never would imagine wearing it to the White House. But like, does she have to care? No, she does not, because, you know, her fiance has hundreds of zeros more wealth than the Bidens will ever have. And Bezos bought himself a seat at the front row of the inauguration, one for her too. So that's where the power lies. That was the big spectacle of the 2025 inauguration, is billionaires seated in front of elected representatives, in front of members of the cabinet. That's never happened in American history before. But that really showed where the power lies now and how they don't have to care about those old rules, which goes back to your point about shame versus impression management. They seem shameless in some ways relative to what used to be broadly held social norms, but they're not invulnerable. We can still get them in their little Achilles heels.
Sir?
But
The question was about the ecosystem of supporting staff around wealth managers, CPAs, attorneys. Yeah. Yeah, and then how inheritance tax has reduced more and more, and how that's kind of been hollowed out, and then how that impacts family offices. Right, and how family offices help to do that.
I would dispute that. Family offices have a lot more purposes than defeating the inheritance tax. Like, you could defeat the inheritance tax. It's so trivial. Remember Trump 1, we had the Secretary of the Treasury say that essentially an inheritance tax is only for stupid people. It's trivial to avoid the inheritance tax. First of all, you have to like meet the threshold, which is $6 million. It's pretty high. But then, like, extremely simple things you can do to make sure that your heirs pay no inheritance tax. Yeah, but it was still trivial to avoid. And, you know, I went to school with people whose family fortunes were based on avoiding it. Ever heard of the Northern Trust Bank? So I went to school. Sitting next to me in 6th grade math was Suzette Bross, who was the granddaughter of the founder of the Northern Trust Bank, Byron Smith. And so I got to hear all about this. And around the dinner table, this is what that family would talk about. Like, ha ha ha, inheritance tax law, what a joke. And many of the people I knew personally were the beneficiaries of generations of skipping around that inheritance tax, because what you do is you create generation skipping trusts. We're way down in the weeds here legally, but it has been for generations not that big a deal. If you hire a sufficiently skilled lawyer, it's just not that big a deal. And you know, I write in chapter 2 of this book about how people like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, his philosopher friend, were obsessed with the idea of preventing exactly that kind of outcome, on the theory that you can't have a real democracy if some people start way ahead of others economically, if they inherit their wealth. So that's why Jefferson, back in the day, when the only meaningful wealth was land wealth, he said, first thing we're going to do is abolish inheritance rules like primogeniture and entailment, which were the rules that said only the eldest son inherited the family land, and that eldest son could never sell or divide up the family land. It had to stay together generation after generation. That's what entailment is. So Jefferson comes out of the gate saying, no more of that. No more titles of nobility, no more inheritance of giant tracts of land. And back in the late 1700s, that would have solved the problem. What he didn't foresee was the Industrial Revolution making fortunes out of cash, which you can't control through entailment and primogeniture. And so that's a big source of the problem we have now.
We'll take one final question, excuse me, and then we've got crudités, wine, books downstairs. Final question, if anyone's got one in the room. One quick one, sure. Question was, how will crypto help wealth managers to further hide offshore wealth?
Crypto is a scam, and no sensible wealth manager wants to get within touching distance of crypto. When you're dealing with people who have hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, they don't want to screw around with crypto, unless they made their fortune on crypto in the first place, in which case what they actually want to do is cash out their holdings and exchange their monopoly money for our real money, which is what the crypto bros who bought Trump are trying to do right now. You know, they're talking about, let's back up a truck to Fort Knox and count the gold. That, I'm pretty sure what that is going to result in is some policy like, well, if you want to get your Social Security check, Grandma, you have to accept it in crypto. Or, you know, you can still get an old-fashioned check in US dollars, but you'll have to wait 8 weeks. Or if you want to get your tax refund, you can get it instantly in crypto, but not in dollars. Some sort of crisis that will lead to crypto being presented as a solution, even though nobody wants it. The free market has rejected it. The only people who like crypto are criminals and people who feel that they can't be upwardly mobile in the normal ways, and they want to work around. but nobody who like has an established fortune made of actual money wants to touch it. And no wealth manager I ever met would touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Can I just add something to that? In Hampshire, the New Hampshire legislature
I'm bracing myself.
has just voted to say that the New Hampshire treasurer must accept crypto.
Just a comment that the New Hampshire legislature has just passed a bill saying that the New Hampshire treasurer has to accept crypto. I take it in payment for fines, taxes, everything else. Any comment? And
Would I lie about that?
first in the nation.
Crypto bros have a lot of money, and they are going around the United States buying up legislators. Does anyone here know who Maxine Waters is?
Mm-hmm.
Maxine Waters has for years been a very vocal opponent of crypto. Then the crypto bros came along, and they destroyed the Senate candidacy of Katie Porter, who was a protege of Elizabeth Warren, who also wanted to use her law degree to shut down or at least regulate crypto in a sensible way. And the crypto bros in California were like, we're going to make an example of you. So they buried her. They just poured so much money into her Senate campaign, or into her opponent in the Senate campaign, that she lost. On a dime, Democratic elected representatives to Congress in California did a 180 and were like, oh, crypto, seems like a great idea, including Maxine Waters, which was like, it was like invasion of the body snatchers. And so now they're coming for our state. And like, if you want to like get me out in the streets with pitchforks and torches, that's the way to do it. There is no way in hell I'm going to take this lying down, and I don't think anyone else in this room should do it either.
Well, on that note, if we can thank Brooke for a great evening, and we'll see you downstairs.